Thank you so much for being here. Welcome to our Policy and Practice Seminar. This is hosted by the UCL Department of Political Science and the School of Public Policy. My name is Aparna Ravi. I'm a lecturer here in the department, and I'll be your chair for this evening. So the topic of tonight's event is the BRICS, a trade grouping, anti-West alliance, or what? So last year, Russia hosted the 16th intergovernmental meeting of the BRICS, so Brazil, Russia, India, China, and South Africa. And so Egypt and Ethiopia, Iran, and the UAE have become new members of the BRICS. But the BRICS remain an informal grouping. They don't have a founding treaty or a secretariat or headquarters. And so what we want to explore in this panel tonight are what are the main priorities of the BRICS? How do they coordinate their activities? Can they present a united front against Trump's tariffs? And then is there a dominant power? And is that Russia or China? So these are some of the questions we'd like to explore in our expert panel. So we're joined by a panel of experts to discuss these issues. I'll introduce them in the order that they'll be speaking. So we first have Dame Deborah Bronnert DCMG. She's the Director General Europe at the Foreign, Commonwealth and Development Office, FCDO. She was the British ambassador to the Russian Federation from January 2020 to November 2023. Among other posts in her distinguished civil service career, she was ambassador to Zimbabwe from 2011 to 2014, and she's also a graduate of UCL's Slavonic and Eastern European Studies program. And then we'll have Dr. Christopher Sabatini. He's a senior fellow for Latin America at the Chatham House. Prior to that, he was a lecturer at the School of International and Public Affairs at Columbia University, and is currently a lecturer of practice at LSE's School of Public Policy. He's also served as the senior director of policy at the Americas Society and the Council of the Americas, and is the founder and the editor-in-chief of the policy magazine America's Quarterly. He's also the director of Latin America and the Caribbean at the National Endowment of Democracy. And then finally, we have Avantika Chilkoti. She's the global business writer for The Economist. She previously served as international correspondent, focusing on development and aid. She's also the host of the Modi Raj, which is a podcast about Indian Prime Minister Narendra Modi. Before joining The Economist, she covered finance for the Wall Street Journal and was a foreign correspondent for the Financial Times, based in Mumbai and Jakarta. And just a quick a note on format. So each speaker will offer opening remarks for about 8 to 10 minutes. Then we'll have a panel discussion, and then finally we'll open the floor to your questions. The whole session, including the Q&A, is being recorded and will be posted online on the department's website, as well as our YouTube channel and our podcast after the event. Okay, sorry. If you speak, you'll be heard in the recording. If you don't speak, you'll be not. We'll let you know when the recording is available. Okay, so we'll start with Deborah, please.
Great. Fantastic. Look, it's really great. Thank you so much. And it's really great to see you all and be back at UCL. I thought in my remarks I would talk a bit about the history and the context, particularly as someone who's a practitioner of diplomacy, who's a diplomat, and talk in particular at the beginning about the G7, which is just turning 50 this year, because I think it's useful context in understanding the BRICS, and it's also a reminder of something that is maybe set up with some short-term goals, can last quite a long time, and perhaps even if folks at the time weren't expecting it to. I thought it would also be worth mentioning the G20, because that's an organisation that brings together both the G7 and a lot of the BRICS, but of course, as the BRICS is expanding, it's going beyond that grouping. So just a few words of that. And then I was going to talk a little bit about when I was in Russia and seeing the Russians changing their approach to the BRICS, particularly after the impact of the full-scale invasion of Ukraine. So we saw a really big shift in the Russian approach and investment in the BRICS at that moment. But back to the G7 as the sort of the oldest of these informal groupings, which don't have a formal headquarters, don't have a secretariat, but which countries do invest in, and leaders are prepared to spend time on. And as many of you will know, the G7 is small, it's flexible, it's informal. Leaders can have quite frank conversations, and they can get to know one another quite well and have, sometimes quite major bust-ups, but they can also be friendly, and it can lead to quite significant impact in the real world. So the G7 started as the G6 back in 1975, when the leaders of that point, the major dominant world economies, the industrialised nations, France, Germany, Italy, Japan, the UK and the US, met. And that was in response to the 1973 oil crisis. They're all, of course, democracies. Canada joined in 76, and then the EU joined in 1977. But it never hosts the G7. It's never chairing it. But the EU leaders have been there since 1977. Russia, of course, was brought in 1998, and it became the G8 at that point. Russia was suspended in 2014 following its annexation of Crimea, and the group is now the G7 again. I was most engaged from 2009 to 2011 because I was one of the negotiators for the then G8. So I sat round the table. I was what's called the sous Sherpa. I worked with the Sherpa who prepared the overall summit, but I was one of the people who I think we would say did most of the work. So it did most of the negotiating until 2 or 3 in the morning to agree communiques, which weren't binding in a legal form, but actually did have real world impacts. And as I say, at that point, we had the Russians round the table as part of an attempt to bring Russia, after the collapse of the Soviet Union, into the international fold in a way that would lead to cooperation, and we thought a different and better world. Even in the 2000s, I think the G7 or G8 was recognising that the world was changing and changing very rapidly. And in 2007, the Germans started a new initiative which involved bringing China, India, Brazil, South Africa and Mexico round the table. But I think it's fair to say that they weren't full members, they were invited, and they only came to part of the meeting. At that point, of course, they were a relatively small part of the global economy, and they weren't regarded, they were the upcoming powers, but they weren't regarded as at that point, as really major powers in terms of the global picture. The +5 arrangement largely fell away with the global financial crisis because at that point the G20, which had been leading at finance minister level since the Asian financial crisis in 97, suddenly came into its own. And at that point, the G8, as it was, realised that they couldn't deal with the financial fallout from the global financial crisis, and that they had to bring in a bigger range of economies and more systemic. And that's when the G20 started meeting at leader level, first in Washington and then in London, and then it started rotating round in the same way that the G7 does. So, and I should have said, sorry, that met for the first time in the autumn of 2008 in Washington and then in London in 2009. And it was really clear at that point that the G7, the G8 summit, as it was in L'Aquila, which was enormous. It was Berlusconi was in the chair, and I remember being there, and there must have been 100 countries there, including Gaddafi with his tent in the middle of the conference compound. But even so, despite that number of countries, it was the G20 grouping that was really making the difference in global affairs. Now, alongside all of this, we started with the BRIC, and that was the BRICS was the term coined by Jim O'Neill of Goldman Sachs at the time in 2001, Brazil, Russia, India, China. And he was using it to describe the fact that he was seeing the potential of these economies, even though they were still quite small in global terms, but they were definitely rising very fast. 2006, their foreign ministers met for the first time in the margins of the UN, and it was Russia who hosted the first summit in 2009 in Yekaterinburg. They were still, of course, at that point, a member of the G8, but I think they were recognising that for them to keep their relevance, they were still a relatively, or they were a declining economy, that to keep their relevance, they wanted to broaden out the groups they were part of. 2010, South Africa joined the group, expanding it. So then we really could call it BRICS, which I think is a slightly easier term than BRIC. When it was set up, it was all about these emerging markets, how they could cooperate together, promote economy, trade. It didn't really have a political element, I think it's fair to say. But it did launch later on the New Development Bank with a focus on infrastructure and sustainable development projects. Just to finish off, because I'm sure my panellists will pick all of this up, I think what we saw in more recent years, as tensions grew globally, particularly between Western countries and Russia and China, we saw much more investment by these countries in the BRICS grouping. And when I was in Russia, one of the things which was really interesting was in 2024, when the Russians were taking on the presidency, just how, despite the strains on their budget, because at this point they were, full on financing the full-scale invasion and destruction of Ukraine, they still managed to host about 500 events linked to their BRICS presidency, and of course were pushing very strongly for a big expansion of the BRICS, in particular to include some of the countries who were still prepared to deal with them. From after in 2022, 2023, the Russians were finding it really hard to get people to come to Russia. All their big flagship events were, they were. Sorry, no disrespect, but they were celebrating the Taliban coming to their big international event in St. Petersburg. They were celebrating, again, no disrespect, but the Vice President of Laos coming to their Eastern Economic Forum in the way that a few years previously it would have been the Indian Prime Minister, the Japanese Prime Minister, the German Chancellor, and so on. So I think at that point, the Russians saw a big opportunity with the BRICS, have been investing very heavily in it and trying to pull into its ambit some of the countries who are still voting with them. However, of course, the original members, and indeed some of the countries which are starting to join, are not aligning themselves with Russia when it comes to global politics. They're not really aligning themselves with Russia when it comes to global economics either. So I think one of the questions will be whether the BRICS, and particularly in this expanded format, can really come together with that unity of purpose, which has actually kept the G7 together over 50 years and has continued, despite quite a lot of challenges, and I predict we'll see a few challenges, and we've got the G7 foreign ministers meeting in Canada today, so we'll see what comes out of there. Despite those challenges, the G7 has survived. So I think it will be really interesting to see how and if the BRICS can really reconcile all these different objectives with their members and the expansion of their members to really maintain a cohesive and influential force.
Yes, thank you. Thanks for the invitation, Aparna. Thank you. All of you for attending. I like doing these things. As Aparna was saying, I sort of occupy a weird nether region between academia and policy, having worked also in government. So I'm going to talk about two things on the BRICS. One is my traditional concern and criticism and skepticism about the BRICS. And the second is the new current environment, thanks to the, as a friend of mine calls him, the toddler-in-chief in the White House. So the first on the BRICS is, look, when you look at the history and the theory of international relations and how to build multilateral organizations, there are certain commonalities. And that is that states and nation states are willing to surrender a certain amount of their sovereignty for a larger public good. Okay, that is true, for example, the United Nations. It's true in the case of the WTO, the World Trade Organization. It's true in the European Union. It's true in NATO. Okay? What that means is whether it's actually committing your defense to defend a broader collective good, or it's even agreeing that popular sovereignty and the rights of individuals to demand an accountable government and protect their liberties is greater than national sovereignty, or whether it's the idea that free trade benefits all and that you're willing to surrender your control of your national borders and tariffs and taxes to a broader public good, all those things are what drive traditional, and I would say successful, multilateral organizations. None of them are present in the BRICS. at all. It is simply a roving series of summits that came together because one economist said, hey, look at these economies. These could be good investment opportunities, okay? It's like forming the S&P 500 as an international bloc. It doesn't make sense. They have lots of summits, and they've expanded. So it's gone from the BRICS to include Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, the UAE, and they just added a few more partner organizations, Belarus, Bolivia, Kazakhstan, Cuba, Malaysia, Thailand, Uganda, oh, there's two more, Uzbekistan and Nigeria. Okay, there are several problems with this. The first is they did create the new development bank. That's actually only capitalized up to $50 billion right now, which actually makes it less capitalized than the American Development Bank. The second is, again, there are no concrete collective agendas among these countries. Not even in the case of Russia, the idea of defending national borders that have been enshrined in international law. There was no reaction from Brazil. We can talk about Brazil's now more pro-Ukraine than the United States, but that's a different issue probably. But there are none of the basic principles or foundations of multilateral organizations that exist. They're trying, yes, there have been some trade agreements, but those are mostly memoranda of understanding. There are some efforts now to create some sort of blockchain exchange to be able to avoid dollar dominance when it comes to applying sanctions. First of all, we'll see whether that works. There's questions about the capacity to do that, especially given the lopsidedness of the BRICS, given China's dominance in that trade among it, as well as its political dominance. But also within that, there are questions about whether they even have that much trade among them that can sustain that outside of the traditional EU and Brussels-based SWIFT system and the like. But there are also two other problems. The first is it's an incredibly diverse group. This was mentioned a little while ago. So what do these countries have in common? In fact, if you were to add up, we started with the BRIC, it became the BRICS. Now it's just an alphabet soup. Okay, it has probably, I think it has more vowels than consonants now that I think about it. It's a bad Scrabble game, actually, is what it really is. The second is, and these are different regime types. You have a Cuban regime that's been in power since 1959. You have a democratic regime in Brazil that actually pushed back against a coup attempt from an extreme right-wing president that supposedly stands in defense of human rights, but isn't willing to commit to those within the BRICS. You have, other countries. You have one that's based on basically a theocracy, Iran. There is very little shared common identity in terms of human rights, in terms of principles among these groups, and consequently, what else are they going to do? The second issue is that this is beginning to sound more and more like the non-aligned movement of the Cold War, which didn't do a heck of a lot. Had a lot of meetings. They ranted and raved, a lot of exhortation, a lot of platitudes. But, when you think about the history of international relations in the last 50 years, you think about the UN, the non-aligned movement doesn't really figure in. Let's be honest. Now, having said that, that's not to say that the BRICS agenda and some of these ideas don't have a certain resonance and importance. The UN Security Council, for example, needs to be reformed. Questions of human rights, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights, needs to emphasize more the sorts of human rights that the Global South holds dear for obvious reasons: cultural, social, and economic rights. The fact that the U.S., for example, can intervene with impunity and steamroll the UN Security Council in Iraq is deeply troubling. There's a real agenda here, but what is increasingly happening, I can say this even Chatham House rule because I live under it, of an unnamed source, is that even some of the other BRICS members are beginning to feel a little uncomfortable with the fact that China is driving this not to be a meaningful forum for Global South's concrete agenda, but is an anti-U.S. forum. I'm not saying that's not legitimate. What I am saying, though, is that's not the foundation for a meaningful multilateral organization that will have a future. Okay, I'll end on just a few other points. The first is that a lot of the things that Deborah just talked about are also at risk. I mean, this is the idea. First of all, the G7, again, they were all democracies. The G20 were, again, to draw the contrast with the BRICS, was intended to facilitate monetary coordination during the collapse in 2008, 2009. Again, the BRICS don't have that. But what we are seeing is, again, and I'll name a name, and I'll name a country, Donald Trump and the U.S. is trying to blow up even those organizations as well. Okay, we saw that Marco Rubio didn't attend the G20 and the pre-G20 meeting in South Africa, complaining about the wokest agenda of South Africa. Donald Trump is also basically is kind of writing off. There's a famous picture, if you haven't seen it, of Donald Trump at the G7 meeting with his arms crossed and all these leaders around him. Unless he's the center of attention, he doesn't want to be there. So there's a larger issue of the broader reshuffling of even multilateral organizations that work. Again, why they worked, I've already said. I don't need to repeat it. And also the G20 meeting, or pre-meeting in South Africa, the Treasury Secretary didn't attend. This was the one for finance ministers. I think he sent like an intern or something. No offense against interns. I've been an intern. I just shouldn't have been in a G20 meeting as an intern. I think it's an open question whether Donald Trump will also attend the G20 meeting. And then what happens? You've taken out the largest economy, well, second largest after China, economy in the world, in one of the premier forums for coordination on concrete issues. And then, like in many things that we're facing in the world today, whether it's NATO, EU, even the UN, and in the region I focus on, the Organization of American States, basically we're looking at basically the US completely pulling out. I don't know how you rebuild this. So I know this is about the BRICS, but I also want to demonstrate that this is occurring within a broader context of global reshuffling that fundamentally challenges a lot of the precepts and foundations of international coordination over meaningful issues, and in which, I will say this about the BRICS, they identified an issue, again, greater global south voice in the WTO, in the UN, what have you, and now, unfortunately, I think those things are less relevant now, not because of the BRICS, but because of the current administration in the U.S.
Can you hear me? Great. Well, thank you for having us. You're under Chatham House rules. You have all kinds of diplomatic discretion as a journalist. What I can afford is basically I can say whatever I want. And so what I'd love to do is to begin actually by asking you guys a question. You know, right now is such an interesting moment to have this conversation. When we first, you guys kindly first invited us, it was before Donald Trump, toddler-in-chief, took over in the White House. And since then, you know, this entire conversation has changed. You've seen the entire transatlantic relationship coming into question. Be it the treatment of Zelensky in the Oval Office, be it sort of J.D. Vance at the Munich Security Conference, more or less scolding European powers. This has pretty much prompted a complete reappraisal of the balance of power in the world. So the question I want to ask you guys is, you know, do you think, put your hand up if you think that it's important that the US-led world order remains US-led? We have one and a half, at least one shy hand, and then one hand. And I think, and another one at the back. Well, so this is incredibly interesting. So, you know, I work for a liberal newspaper, and we sit there and we have defended this again and again, year after year, war in or war out. And I think if there is one thing that holds this group together, to your point, is precisely the way that most people in this room feel, which is questioning the Western-led order, the American-led order. And, you know, perhaps all of these groupings are slightly symbolic. And if they are symbolic, there is a symbolism in that. And, you know, to start from the beginning, I'll do two things. One, I'll talk to you about sort of the symbolic clout that this group does have, and then focus a bit on India, because that is, I assume, why you asked me. And use India as sort of an example of the power play that goes on in these groups. So firstly, you know, as you said, this was a grouping that was brought about because a Goldman Sachs banker thought about which economies might do well. And for a long time after he said this, it seemed like a pretty bad bet. If he put money on that, it was looking like he was probably losing quite a lot of money. But since then, this grouping, whether it had expanded or not, has become increasingly important. So, almost 50% of the world's population, now almost 40% of the world's crude oil production. If you think about global GDP, it's about 25%. And, there might not be trade agreements between these countries, but if you look at trade between BRIC countries versus their trade with the G7, the inter-BRICS trade is just growing far faster. So, in recent times, the economic growth in these markets, it does make them relevant. Again, pre-expansion or post-expansion, it is increasingly relevant. And I think the most interesting example to me, which you mentioned just now, is the idea of creating an alternative to a dollar-denominated world economy. This is really, even if it is totally symbolic, I would put my money on this never actually happening. Making big steps and starting a conversation about this is incredibly important. And the mechanism that they sort of have talked about setting up is called BRICS Bridge. It's based on two things, two very important ideals that countries within this grouping care about. One, which is questioning American dominance, and two, which is getting around sanctions. And I'm not in finance or even an economist, so I'll explain it to you the way that a colleague explained it to me, which was when money is sent around the world, it's a bit like taking a long-haul flight. And the way things are set up now, you've got to stop at JFK. You've got to go through America. And that gives America this panopticon power. And it means you're always dealing with an American airport, an American correspondent bank. Doing away with this would completely change the way the global economy works. And, there's a lot of wrangling within the BRICS about whether this should actually go ahead. But there has been a lot of steps taken towards creating this sort of system. Interestingly, a lot of the technology has come from China. A lot of the technology that would allow this to work, the digital currencies that would be required, the sort of banking infrastructure, it's come from China. And I think, just to show you the sort of symbolic heft of this is what prompted Donald Trump in December to turn around and say, I'm going to introduce 100% blanket tariff on anything coming out of BRICS countries. Why? Because of this suggestion. And it goes to show the symbolic weight of this grouping and the conversations that they can begin. And just to sort of segue into the next thing I offer to speak about, which is the India angle. India has this week come out and said, absolutely not. We're not backing this. We believe in the dollar-backed global economic order. There's nothing wrong with it. And it just goes to show another part, which is that there are a lot of splits within the interests of the BRIC countries. And let me talk you through what I see as India's stake in the BRICS. So India was, of course, non-aligned, and now they'll say that they're multi-aligned. As far as I can tell, it's very much the same thing. And in summaries, it's basically, we'll be friends with whoever it suits us to be friends with, and we'll be frenemies with whoever it suits us to be frenemies with. And so you've seen through the war in Ukraine, Narendra Modi refusing to condemn Russia. You've seen India, the economy has benefited hugely from India buying lots and lots of Russian oil and gas. And at the same time, you've seen India cozying up to the US. You've seen defense deals with the US. You've seen lots and lots of commercial deals with the US. You've seen Donald Trump and Narendra Modi sort of backslapping red carpets being rolled out. And I think that the Indian example is so interesting because this idea of multi-alignment, this idea of I'll take whatever I can get, is exactly what countries that aren't included in the G7 logically should and will be doing. It's sort of the only way to pragmatically operate if you're not part of the dominant rich world grouping. And they're getting away with it. So if you think about the sort of assassination attempts in Canada, perhaps even in the US, did not change the fact that Narendra Modi could welcome all the G20 leaders to India. Again, more backslapping there. It doesn't change the fact that big trade deals continue to be done with India since what I think would have been 5-10 years ago, a pretty shocking news event. And so you see through the one lens of this one man, the way in which different groupings are used, the way in which different friendships sort of can get cashed in at different times. And so perhaps to summarize, the sort of benefits of this group is purely symbolic. And the leaders who are part of it will turn up and will sort of say what they want when they want. Doesn't stop them turning up to G20 meetings, doesn't stop them being part of the Quad. It's just another sort of diplomatic gathering to add to the endless agenda, as far as I can tell.
Great. Thank you so much. Thank you. Can open up the floor. So I'll collect a group of 3 questions and then have you answer, and then we can kind of go forward. Okay, so we have 1, 2. Okay. So these 2 questions.
Okay. I'm from UCL and from the political sciences, and thanks for your sharing, insightful sharing. And so I have a question for Christopher. Does the United States perceptions of China's ambitions as a direct threat and is a resolve the continue China's race inevitable lead to the geopolitical competition and conflict? And also, I was wondering about that. Could you please, from the corporations, a perspective of cooperation, and how do you think the China's and the United States can cooperate? Yes, this is 2 questions. Thank you.
This is one of the criticisms I think all of you sort of mentioned, but these countries that came together, they're ideologically very different, right? The way the politics is very different. Some of them are democracies, at least on paper, some of them are not. And that really creates an issue where that's something that worked in the UN, that they had a common goal and they sort of ideologically and economically aligned on those terms. So how do you think that is a criticism that BRICS has been facing throughout from the time that they have come together? How do you think they can combat, given the complicated situation that they're in? Have you thought about any sort of solutions or something that they can effectively actually integrate?
Hi, Nasser Dajani. I graduate from UCL Security Studies. Actually, my question is to Christopher. Don't you think that your critique of BRICS is also applicable to the G7 when it started in the 70s? It was a largely anti, communist group when it started. So isn't it? How come it's applicable to BRICS but not to the G7? Thank you.
Okay, so what's your name again?
It's Grace.
Grace. Okay, so first, Grace, on the question of China and competition, for many BRICS countries, referring particularly to India and Brazil here, BRICS was also seen as a way of taking advantage of China's growth and the growth of price and boom of commodities, but also as a way to try to rein it in a bit. In the case of China, to help ease historic tensions between the 2 countries, as a way for Brazil of trying to, if you will, sort of harness its own global ambitions to China. I think what's happened is, especially with the addition now at China's insistence of Iran and Ethiopia, that there's a sense that, wait, maybe this is growing a little too fast for Brazil's own comfort. This happened in South Africa, and I guess I'm going to reveal indirectly who was uncomfortable about that. Was they came back and they're like, they went there to get an invitation for Argentina to join the BRICS. Instead, they came back with a number of other countries that joined the BRICS, and then they took their invitation to Argentina to join the BRICS. And Argentina, I kind of like it. It's kind of like if you probably, given your ages, probably this will make no relevance whatsoever. It's kind of like if you had an extra ticket to a Barry Manilow concert, and you went to your friends and was like, hey, would you like to go see Barry Manilow with you? And they're like, nah, I got to wash my hair that night. Argentina was like, nah, I don't know about the BRICS. Thank you very much. By the way, look up Barry Manilow. It'll it makes sense if you grew up in the 70s and 80s. So I think Brazil kind of felt outplayed by China. Now, on your very good question also about the competition, I think it was also an attempt to try to reduce, tamp down. I mean, the competition with China didn't really start to pick up until Trump, but it continued under Biden. Of course, now it's really hit, it's on steroids. And I do think there's a risk. And I do think for Brazil and other countries within the BRICS, the idea is let's tamp this down. Let's try to avoid geopolitical competition that hurts us all. China is Brazil's #1 export market. They do not want to see a global. It's also the #1 export market for Argentina, despite the current president's anti-Chinese rhetoric, Chile and Peru, Uruguay as well. So there's a real sense that they want to sort of correct this and not get caught up in this bipolar conflict that is emerging, and I think bears a real risk. So, Grace, that's my answer. I forgot your name? Nehan? Okay. So you're asking about the sort of the UN, the complicated politics. I think one of the things that the BRICS could do well is the issue that you were mentioning is on sanctions. I mean, according to a Washington Post analysis, there are more than 36,000 sanctions in the world right now. Okay, this is, hate to say it, an abuse primarily of the dollar and, if you will, sort of the JFK sort of bridge, as well as the SWIFT banking system. And also what used to be one of the considered completely out of line with most sanctions policies, which was a U.S.-Cuba sanctions, extraterritoriality. So if in the old days, people used to complain about this in 1996, if you're a Spanish hotel company and you invest in Cuba, you could get sanctioned. You could even get arrested if you're the CEO of Sol Malia, which is Spanish, if you set foot in. Now, actually, a lot of countries are engaging in extraterritoriality, where the U.S. is applying it across the board in that sense. So it's a complete abuse of U.S. judicial systems, U.S. financial systems, and U.S. banks, and the U.S. dollar, to the extent that I think the BRICS can foster a more constructive discussion on basically the abuse of power of the dollar, and maybe even create it will significantly weaken the U.S. system, but the truth is the U.S. is weakening itself, and this idea that the U.S. is going to impose a 100% tariff on BRICS is just going to further fragment the system. It will have dramatic effects. It will ultimately weaken U.S. power, but also Western power. And those sanctions against Russia that I think many of us, I personally support, would be meaningless if the BRICS fight back. Anira, right? Was that? I had your name. Nasser. Sorry about that. My notebook closed. On the G7, what's the difference between the G7 and the BRICS? Well, first of all, the number. The second is the G7 were all democracies. The third is they were all market economies. And the fourth is they were primarily pushing back on OPEC and the rise in oil prices and trying to coordinate economic and financial policies. But they're also partners in what was then the GATT, the General Agreements on Tariffs and Trade. They're also partners within other networks of organizations. So it's far more embedded in commonalities in economics, commonalities in regime type, commonalities in worldview, and commonalities even in defense arrangements. So it was much more linked to an existing world order. I'm not saying that it was perfect. I'm not saying it wasn't discriminatory. It's just there was much more there, to quote Gertrude Stein about Oakland.
Look, I'm not going to cover all of that, but I would comment. And I'm also I'm not agreeing with you. I should say on a number of, but I do think the BRICS is now 16. So I wouldn't write it off. I agree with you that I absolutely agree that the expansion is. I think. If I were one of the negotiators, I think I would be looking at this in absolute horror at how on earth you brought anything meaningful together. But that doesn't mean that they can't do anything, and it doesn't mean that there won't be some kind of course correction. It does occur to me one of the issues that they are looking at is the issue of climate change. And I think there is potential there that could be quite powerful and positive, depending on how it's approached. So I'm not saying that it will replace anything else, but it might be quite an important supplementary action. And I do think, you know, when I think it's absolutely right. The G6 as it was, G7, G8, now G7 again. It's an informal grouping. It's got many of the attributes in that sense of the BRICS, but it did have more commonality of purpose. And I do think, you know, in the years when I was there, and it wasn't an attempt to expand, but we were so inclusive that it was almost turning into the United Nations. That made it really, really difficult. And one of the things I think that has helped it survive and succeed is keeping it small and focused and keeping that commonality. So it does seem to me that the drive to expand the BRICS in the way is going to be a really big challenge. And I do wonder whether at some point there will be some kind of a course correction. But what that will be, whether it's another grouping called something else, another alphabet soup, or whether it's a pulling back or you know, going back to basics, I don't know. But it does seem to be in this form, it's quite hard to see how the BRICS really motors in the way that either the G7 or the G20 has been able to.
Can I add something on your point about, you know, is there anything tangible that they can do? Well, you know, it's all very well us making kind of big, broad statements, but there is something tangible that they do some tangible things. So I think the New Development Bank is a really interesting example. You know, again, I have just said that it's a lot of the organization's power is in symbolism, and this development bank was set up exactly 70 years to the day from Bretton Woods. And, you know, it's the context of after COVID, you know, at a time when climate change is impacting a lot more poor countries than rich ones, there's an understanding amongst the non-G7 world that those institutions weren't and aren't working for us, basically. And setting up a new development bank that way is interesting. Sure, look, the size of this bank is not big, right? So if you look at all the money they've ever spent, it's a fraction of what the World Bank spends in 1 year. It's not a lot of money. Every organization that puts money into the New Development Bank probably puts more money into other multilateral institutions. A lot, as I said, are in the AIIB. But think about the way they've structured this bank. So it doesn't come with structural reforms, you know, the way that a lot of World Bank money has. A lot of the money, as you say, goes into renewables. And this is also a strategic move, because if you're doing renewable energy, a lot of the minerals you need, a lot of the products you need are coming from BRICS countries. Right? So in India, for example, the whole green economy push is a really big part of the Modi agenda. So again, you're pushing your own strategic interests via this bank. And as I say, look, it's not a lot of money, but it does serve as showing the world that there is an alternative way. You know, you come back to the issue of currency. The goal for them is to give 30% of their loans out, not in the US dollars. So, you know, we're being flippant by saying that this is sort of a useless organization and it's just like an excuse to get together. There are tangible things that they do, and just because you don't have tons of money doesn't mean that you can't make a point.
I'm being provocative intentionally. I'm not even agreeing with everything I say. But I do think, you know, first of all, especially with this administration, they're committing a series of own goals on the dollar, on climate change, on multilateral organizations, on trade, what have you. In these cases, I do think a much more slimmed down, more modest BRICS or some grouping could actually play a very important corrective role on climate change, reducing the dominance of the dollar. So I'm being intentionally provocative. I'm not agreeing with everything I say. But.
Great. I think we should have another. I can go around, yeah. I'll just try and open it up a bit.
Hello, I'm Victor. Thank you so much for the insights. It was really interesting. And so Brazil is today the president of BRICS and is a strong supporter of the United Nations Security Council reform, as was mentioned. The BRICS is also officially supporting this reform, I think in 2023. And so my question is the group today in a good position to push for this reform? given that 2 of its members are also part of the G4 group for the reform, and also with so many African countries that could potentially represent the African Union. And also, given the US shift away from its Western allies recently with Donald Trump, could the UK and France be more willing to push for the reform? Or even more generally, is the reform even a realistic concept, idea?
Hi, my name is Rick. I have a question for the whole panel, which is, to what extent does BRICS create an opening for sort of a Chinese-led or Chinese-dominated alternative system, and what would be the implications of this?
Well, yeah, we just wanted to. Did I see one more question over here? Okay. Yeah, go ahead.
I'd quite like to hear a bit more about how big the risk of de-dollarization you think is. Particularly, it seems to have come up in the debate around seizing these Russian assets. I'm just interested how big a risk you think it is when we're thinking about things like that.
Okay. So yeah, feel free to go ahead. Whoever wants to take it.
Yeah, I could say a couple of things. So on the Chinese-dominated, Chinese-led system, I think this, for one, is the preoccupation of a lot of countries within the BRICS. Certainly for India, that's a preoccupation. And throughout everything that we've just mentioned, the idea of this basically being a Chinese-led group, so it's an alternative to the US-led order, but it's just a new Chinese-led order, has existed. So, for example, I think I told you that the technology for the new alternative to settlement via SWIFT is all backed by Chinese technology. On top of that, when you had the expansion talks in the last few years, a lot of the concerns for countries like India was that countries that wanted to join BRICS were seeing this as a way to get China's ear, to get China's money. And then when you look at the development bank, you look at the new development bank, a lot of the money is in parallel with, Belt and Road projects, basically. So, it is a valid risk. I think that there are countries within the grouping that are very aware of this, and that is their main, I'd say, sort of the main metric by which they back or don't back policies in the BRICS grouping. On the de-dollarization, I think it's a really interesting one. I mean, the fact that Donald Trump sort of lashed out with this idea of 100% tariff just goes to show what a big threat it is. They certainly have the technology in place. So it's basically using digital currency. So the central bank runs the currencies. It's all backed by fiat currency. It's apparently pretty efficient. So it's cheap, it's quick, it works. The trouble for the Western order is that it's inspired by Enbridge, which is a BIS system. So, BIS, big, well-respected grouping, had come up, pre-Ukraine war with an alternative to, dollar-denominated financing. And it's based on that. It's based on that technology. So it very much can happen. The question is if politically it will be allowed to. The fact that India has come out this week and a few other BRIC members have come out this week and said, we don't back it, just goes to show how much this is a political decision to kind of push that through or not. Technically, yeah, sure, it can. If it's backed by digital currencies, it can hypothetically happen.
No, maybe just a few thoughts. I think, was it Victor was talking about UK, France leadership. We remain very close to the United States and we are in constant contact pretty much. We are also in constant contact with our friends and colleagues and allies in France as well. So I'm not going to say too much about what's going on at the moment, but I was saying the rather lovely Lenin quote that there are weeks where decades pass. It certainly has felt like that in diplomacy over the last couple of weeks. But I don't recognise all of this language about breaking alliances and so on. It's definitely unpredictable. It's definitely providing lots of work for diplomats. But I think I would wait and see is what I would say. I do think that the decision by the government to thicken up relations with European partners and the European Union, which obviously was from the election, our election, and not related to the US election, is the right one, and that's part of my day job. But I think I wouldn't. I think you're being a bit too dramatic about all of these organisations, and I think we are seeing a lot of headlines. We're seeing a lot of things happening, but I'm not sure the fundamentals are being shaken in quite the way that is being expressed. Let's wait and see a bit. I think on de-dollarisation, I don't see a short-term risk, but there are lots of conversations going on, and I do think we will look, assuming I'm still alive in 20 years, I think looking back, the world will have changed enormously again, and so what I'm not doing is say that it won't ever happen, but I just don't see a strong global interest in it happening in the short term, and I think, and I think the point, that yes, the BRICS is very much a Chinese-led organisation. That was part of the point. It was so that countries could, get more time with China as the big rising global power. It is partly the way that China and India manage their quite complicated relationship, but I don't see any signs of that lessening off. China will continue, I think, to be the dominant power in that grouping, with significant rivalry and contestation from India in particular.
So, Victor, the first question that you asked about the UN Security Council expansion, it's not an easy path. The issue of, obviously, would China let India join? Brazil and Mexico both want to vie for that position. As you yourself said, within the African Union, who would occupy of that large continent that seat? Japan wants a seat at the UN Security Council. There are a few interesting options out there. They may be too ambitious, but they're interesting, and I don't mean that in the sort of British way of saying, they're interesting. Yeah, right. Though they really are, in the sense of expanding and having some rotating seats, and if you will, sort of diluting the veto power of some of the vetoing countries, so that you get, in the case of regions where sort of aspiring global powers in those regions get a seat, but they then have to share it or rotate it out. And again, the veto is diluted or made some sort of supermajority. Those could happen. I would like to see them happen. I do think, again, to your point too about the World Bank, the Bretton Woods system, these are institutions that not only haven't they not been reformed since their founding in some ways, they've taken on new things that made them much more exclusionary. The whole wave of neoliberalism, the market reforms of the IMF, completely changed the whole nature of the IMF. That the new development bank is now supporting infrastructure, one of the critical needs of the developing world that had been neglected by the World Bank and the Inter-American Development Bank, are really important things that it's filling that gap. And unfortunately, there's been a certain amount of inertia and even path dependence on these institutions. So it won't be easy. I think there are ideas out there, but there's a lot of competition even within those aspirants to the UN Security Council. On the question of will there be a Chinese-led system, quite frankly, I don't think any of the BRICS countries want a Chinese-led system. In fact, I'm pretty sure they don't want a Chinese-led system. They're willing to try to break a U.S.-dominated system, but within Latin America, the term now is strategic neutrality. This idea of trying to maintain a balance so they don't have to pick sides, and understandably resisting this idea that the U.S., we saw it on the Trump one, we're seeing it now, resurrects the Monroe Doctrine and says, this is our hemisphere, China better get out. Even we saw this in the Panama Canal. Supposedly Trump is mobilizing U.S. troops for the Panama Canal, which we don't have a base, so I don't know how he'll do that. That's the fear that they're going to get caught in this competition, Grace, as you had mentioned, I believe. On the issue of de-dollarization, it won't happen overnight. It will be very difficult. I do think what you're going to see is an erosion of the dollar's dominance in the way that was said before. There is a risk in some of these cases. I've seen the numbers. I'm not an economist. But that around the BRICS, the problem is so much of the economies of the BRICS member countries are dominated by China that a sort of pure blockchain or a BIS type system will basically mean that a lot of countries end up with renminbi when they're not necessarily won't know what to do with it. So there are some levers and some no blockchains, but blocking points that the U.S. can leverage on that could sort of slow it down. But I think, honestly, it will happen, but it's not going to happen anytime soon.
Maybe just very briefly on UN Security Council reform. So the UK has worked on this, supported this for quite a long time. It's really hard because the veto means there's a veto from the 5 permanent members. But I do think that the last few years have demonstrated just why it's so important. But I'm not terribly optimistic that it's going to happen anytime soon.
One more thing, going back to the issue of sanctions, is the problem too now is that because you're going to see China and Russia block, before sanctions were supposed to go through the UN. That's never going to happen again with China and Russia right now. So the need to reform it so that it can become, so the U.S. doesn't unilaterally consistently impose sanctions is again in the interest of a number of countries. I hope it happens, I honestly do. It's not easy.
The question really quickly. I actually wanted to ask you, so if fundamentally what we're seeing is a G20 splitting into rich countries and not rich countries, and so G7 is rich, does the G7 sit there and think about BRICS? Do you think US and the EU sit and think about the BRICS as a bloc and the power and the clout and the symbolism of the thing? Or is it a bit like the little kid, scrapping at the heels of the big kid in the playground?
So as a British diplomat, we've thought an awful lot over the last few years about Russia. We also think an awful lot about China. I mean, all the component members of the BRICS we think about a lot. Are we seeing at the moment, the BRICS really being a really powerful collective force in the world? Well, not really. So it's not that we don't think about them. Sorry if anyone's in the BRICS. But what I would say is we certainly think a lot about the individual members because of the impact on our interests. But I don't think we're seeing them as a collective as being hugely influential yet. But I'm not writing them off. Partly because I've stopped predicting the future, but I'm not writing them off. But I don't think at the moment we're seeing that cohesiveness from them that would really indicate that you would, think of them as a big bloc as opposed to collections of countries within it.
I have a question. Do you consider BRICS has a positive impact in supporting the poor economies of the world? Because right now we are just criticizing and we are considering that they have a policy, like they lead an economical war against the dollar in particular. But do you think they can participate positively to supporting the other countries, the poor countries, for example? Like, can they influence the other countries positively?
Any other questions on the side?
Making you get
Exactly.
I feel like the more you're going to keep talking, the more questions I'm going to have. But I think about the climate issue that you mentioned, when it comes to... the countries who are... Recently, India rejected the climate finance goal that was come up in COP, and they said it is inadequate and does not really represent what the countries in the global south face. Given that, do you think BRICS can actually come up with an alternative framework, finance framework that can work for the southern countries? And also, do you think it is a little hypocritical to think the way these countries work in terms of their economies, as in their extractive of raw materials, they have manufacturing setups. So it goes for China and India, Russia and Brazil, they export a lot of fossil fuels. So it's kind of contradictory when it comes to the new development bank financing in clean energy goals, but these countries are far away from achieving their own climate goals themselves. How does that play out?
Yeah, I wanted to pick your brain for on this point about the possibility of the BRICS expanding as a loose group for policy coordination. It seems clear to me that, as an international organization, they lack the cohesiveness that you've described, institutionalization, etc. And they have this, internal infighting, in particular with the India, China kind of dyad, etc. But we live in a world now where the U.S. is pushing everyone else to cooperate with each other. Like the European Union is signing trade agreements with India, with Mercosur. So it seems that the world is being pushed to cooperate. So might it work as a venue for an expanding anti-American, anti-Western kind of coordination in this loose sense?
And actually, if I could just quickly add a question, because it related to the development question. So I was also wondering that too, like what are the implications for development, especially because right now we're seeing sort of like the US-China trade war and then the gutting of US aid. And there's been a lot of speculation about how China can sort of step in as a development, both as a kind of development lender as well as a soft power. And so I was just curious, and then even before the US-China trade war, there's so much criticism of the Bretton Woods model, structural adjustment programs, et cetera. So I was just curious about what you think are the implications for Global South countries, and then also sort of from a soft power perspective, the BRIC countries.
Sir, you look too old to be a student. No, he's a professor. He's a friend of mine, Luis. I'll answer the question. The first question about the Global South. Look, let's be honest. Russia and China are not the Global South. First of all, they lack the climate. Global South is warm. Russia's really cold. Russia is a colonizing power in its own right, as is China. That they've defined the Global South is a really remarkable feat of diplomatic messaging and narrative creation. Okay, so I'm not sure the BRICS is the proper forum for that. Having said that, yes, they put it out there. We're now much more aware of South Africa's demands, whether it's climate finance, which has been, I forget, U.S. woefully underfinanced. I mean, the U.S. and the global North has been immorally negligent in following through on its commitments to that. But, if I were choosing a club of Global South countries, I wouldn't put Russia and China there to defend my interests. It does help advance it. But, I know Brazil well, and Brazil's fundamental commitment is to the integrity and defense of national borders and to denounce interstate conflict. I don't see them doing that now, not through the BRICS. So I do think, yes, there's a need. Everything we've talked about, whether it's climate change, finding alternatives to the dollar, updating the multilateral system generally, are legitimate issues that need to be advanced. I'm just not sure the BRICS, though it is doing it, is the proper way to do it. It's put it out there. But I do think we're beginning to see the tensions in that right now when China and Russia are collaborating on the invasion of Ukraine. I'm just not, so sorry to be so blunt, I'm just being provocative again. And I'll just say on climate change, I do think, yes, you've got a fundamental issue here. Brazil is now a major exporter of oil. In fact, I think it's larger than Venezuela. It's larger than, which doesn't take much anymore. Colombia, the actual commitment of these countries to steer away from hydrocarbon production and export is going to be hugely wrenching to their economies. There's going to come a time when they're going to have to, basically put their money where their mouth is, or put their oil where their mouth is. And I hope that can happen. And maybe that's an easier decision to make when you're doing it among a club of equals and not having the U.S. sort of wag its finger at you.
I mean, maybe, on can BRICS help with poverty reduction? Again, I think individual countries have made a huge contribution. I mean, China has pulled 800 million Chinese out of poverty. I mean, that's an amazing thing to do, but I don't see them collectively doing it. And I think one of the things we're being reminded of, actually, with the Trump administration's decisions around USAID is just how significant a player the US has been on development. And, 40% of the WHO, 40% of a lot of these development agencies, this is the US who's been doing this. And so the US deciding to pause has huge implications. The UK, we announced, I think it was 2 weeks ago, that we are increasing our defence spend to 2.5%. That's largely in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And the way we will finance that is we will reduce our development spend and we'll go down from 0.5% of GNI to 0.3% of GNI. That will still keep us in the top sort of 5 or 6 development spenders globally.
Per capita or absolute?
No, absolute. So that kind of tells you, that other countries are not doing that much, given, So I think, again, individually, countries are starting to do some things, but there's a long way to go before they actually start being any way a replacement for what we've got at the moment. And so there's a real, I think on development, on aid, there is an opportunity, but it's in a very tough conditions to really rethink how it's done in a way. Actually, The Economist wrote a rather good article on this, I think. But it's to really think, how it should be done in a way in partnership with the countries concerned, in a way that actually responds to the new reality. And, we are going to see, certainly across Europe, I think, increasing defence budgets, and that is going to have an impact on other budgets. And that is largely in response to Russia's invasion of Ukraine, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And here is Russia claiming to be a voice of the global south while it pushes food prices up across the world, while it actually displaces funding that might have gone to development and puts it into defence budgets.
Yeah, say something about the aid question, actually. I don't know if BRICS will be the solution to this, but you do right now have this moment in time when we can remake the way aid is done globally. So you look at the pledges of how much of GNI all these rich countries are supposed to spend on aid. We're nowhere near those figures. Those targets have almost sort of been forgotten now. If you break that down even more and you look at where a lot of aid spending goes, it doesn't actually go to the poorest countries. What used to be HIPC countries actually get quite a small fraction of global aid spending. A lot of it goes to what we would define as middle income countries. You think about, the Economist literature, we looked at a lot of the economic studies into the impact of aid. So forget humanitarian aid. There's sort of separate issues around that. There's moral reasons for giving humanitarian aid. But you look at development aid. And there is very little economic evidence that it actually has the economic impact it's supposed to have. My hunch personally is that this is not because aid doesn't work. It's because the way that the US has done it has not worked. So USAID, if you look at the figures, 60% of their money goes to 12 organizations. It's all mediated by big Western consultancies. Samantha Power's goal was to get 20% of aid spending to go directly to local organizations. So if the idea is we want to put aid out of business, ideally no country would need aid. That requires there to be a sustainable way of creating aid where you strengthen local capacity, right? Capacity building. And that hasn't happened. And I think, circling back to your question, that ideally it would be BRICS countries helping BRICS countries. That would be capacity building. We have this moment now where the US pause, whatever you want to call it, it will mean that everyone questions taking US money now going forward. A whole generation of Americans who are given 15 minutes to clear their desks at USAID will no longer want to work in aid. And if you could have the poor world stepping up, maybe project-based financing, whatever it would be an incredible thing. Whether it happens, I'm personally not that optimistic.
2 more questions? Anyone wants to jump in? Okay. Well, Yeah, I guess I'll just just a quick follow-up on the aid question. So there's so much talk about BRI, but do you have a sense of, because it's like we have this U.S. aid model and then the BRI model, but then obviously like India's a lender, Brazil's a lender. Is there something different that's like not the U.S. model and not the kind of BRI model that we would be interested in thinking about when we think about this question of like sort of development aid or soft power?
I don't know what the answer is. I do know that what is happening in the world now means we have to rethink how this is all done. But I don't, at this moment, know what the answer is, but I do think that there's some really significant challenges that we've known about for a while, but this is a forcing mechanism. It's a really tough forcing mechanism, but that will, I think, mean that, you know, we need to think again about how do we do this in partnership, how do we do this in a way that genuinely increases economic development in a sustainable way across the globe.
I would actually say that when you say the two alternatives at the moment are the US model and the Chinese model, I don't know about you, but I struggle to understand what the Chinese model is. If you've tried to look at BRI spending, it's almost impossible to trace where the money is. And part of me thinks this is on purpose, right? That the Chinese don't want to disclose loan contracts. But sometimes I realize that this money is going via God knows how many state-owned enterprise and local Chinese banks, and it's actually impossible to figure out what their strategy is in terms of where the money's going, interest rates, length of contract, what they do when you default. I actually don't understand what the Chinese alternative here is at the moment.
Oh, okay, I just kind of meant sort of like the patient capital model. Like there's sort of an argument that China lends in sort of a more patient way than sort of your traditional like IMF, World Bank lending projects, and then it's more around like infrastructure and kind of domestic capacity building. So that's what I meant when I said that. But of course, I could understand that
My
there
point
are
is
different views on.
But you don't even know if it's patient because you don't know the length on some of these contracts. I remember being in Zambia and looking for some of the contracts and asking people in the Ministry of Finance about them. And you know, I just don't even think that we really fully understand how patient it is. And yeah, when they get impatient, what they're going to ask for in return, we also don't know.
Mm-hmm.
Two things. First, you're right. I mean, it's difficult to imagine or reimagine development assistance post-aid. And we can draw out maybe, you know, some sort of global pool in which the billionaires contribute. You know, it's one thing Brazil was advocating for. It never happened. I think it was an overstretch. Unfortunate for the G20 meeting that was last year was an income tax on billionaires, global income tax. A great idea. A million reasons why it won't, but we need to imagine. That could have actually provided some mechanism. Why not tax the global rich who are unaccountable and not putting in? On the BRI model, the truth is they you know, in some cases, region that I know, in Peru, they funded a $3.6 billion port through Costco, which was, if you talk to Peruvians, if you talk to Brazilians, if you talk to Chileans, they appreciate it. They didn't have that port through which, and now China is now offering to build a railroad from Brazil to be able to ship Brazilian products across the Pacific. That's huge. And China's motto has been, you know, build roads to reduce poverty, and they're very successful in reducing poverty. So there are some other models that we could potentially learn. I mean, that the same time they cut the ribbon in the Shanghai port, the 3.6, Joe Biden showed up with 8 Black Hawk helicopters to fight drugs. I mean, clearly the response was completely disproportionate to what, out of proportion to what the Chinese offered. And that is important. The other thing I'll just say, and this is, I'm not saying this because I'm in a university campus right now, but I do think dollar for dollar, pound for pound, the best thing developing countries can do for soft power is provide scholarships. I really believe that. That is, and of course, unfortunately, Trump is actually trying to also end the Fulbright Scholarship Program. And of course, the British Council here has cut back on its funding. That's something that I think, again, it's diffuse, but if you want to build soft power, send people, make them feel welcome, don't insult immigrants, and let them come study in universities.
Great. Thank you. I think that's a good note to end on. So thank you all so much. That's all we have time for. Thank you so much to our speakers. It was a great discussion. And so before we thank our speakers, let me remind you about our next policy and practice event. So this will be Thursday, March 20th, entitled Trump Episode 2, The Imperial President Strikes Back. You can sign up for it via the Department of Political Science website. And if you don't already, please follow the department on Twitter and Instagram. Our handle is UCL SPP. We'll announce all our forthcoming events there. Thank you all for joining us, and thank you for the speakers. Thank you.